going to tell you a story. But I'm going to first tell you a confession. I have always loved school. I am one of those people. And I think it's because there's this clear path between where you are and achievement, and it usually looks like get good grades, do well on tests, graduate. It also feels like school is this system that you and I have been in for the majority of our lives. We know it. It's comfortable. We know the rules. But that comfort doesn't last forever. About 3 years ago, I was graduating from Western Kentucky with one of the top photojournalism departments in the country. And as my friends were walking across the stage with their caps and their gowns, they all had plans for life after graduation. My friends had internships and jobs at really big publications, like the New York Times, the Washington Post, National Geographic. But I walked across the stage and I didn't have a plan. I had no idea what my life would be like post-graduation. So I moved in with my boyfriend. We closed our eyes and picked a place on the map and wound up in Portland, Maine. And it was there that I became a stereotypical millennial. I was college educated. I had internships under my belt. I had study abroad programs that I did. I had thought I had done everything right. But I was a waitress at a restaurant and working at retail, and I felt completely lost. So during this time, I'm calling up my mom a lot, asking her all sorts of questions about what should I do, what should I do, what should I do? And one thing she said to me, this is my mom, one thing she said to me is that you do what you love when no one's watching. And for me to really listen to what was pulling at my heartstrings. When no one was watching, I was listening to podcasts. How many of you guys know what a podcast is? Raise your hand. Nice. For those of you who don't, it is a radio show online. And I was specifically listening to these long-form documentary podcasts. And they struck me because I would think about the people whose lives were being told in these stories as I was going grocery shopping in the store. I would think about, for instance, Christopher Daniel Gay, who was in prison multiple times and escaped multiple times. I always wondered if he would ever be able to reconnect with his daughter again. And in this world where there's so much noise, so much media, the fact that I was thinking about this man whose face I would never see and who I would never meet made me pause. I decided at that moment that I wanted to be a creator of what I was consuming, what I was listening when no one was watching. And so I decided I wanted to be a radio producer. But the problem was, I had never made a radio piece before in my life. So all of a sudden there's this huge gap between where I am and where I want to be, and I have no idea how to close that gap. So I decided to take this thing that I love, school, and apply it to that moment. In 2015, I decided to make a syllabus for myself in this big grad school program that I decided to create. It was 7 pages long. And basically, in this syllabus, I was giving myself a structure and a rhythm where I would wake up in the mornings and I would go online and teach myself how to become a radio producer. I would go on lynda.com and I would teach myself how to make an audio piece by learning all the different audio software programs. I would read these different books, like Out on the Wire, which were told from radio producers who had 20 years worth of experience. They were explaining their process, and I would take notes. And then I would collect people, and I would have them help me become a radio producer. In photojournalism, the class that Jeannie teaches, they teach us that you have to, in order to be a photographer, you can't tell people. You have to show people. And so in this fake grad school program I was making up for myself, I decided to create a thesis project called Millennial. Millennial is a podcast about coming of age, and I was documenting my life as I was going through it. And with each episode, I was practicing becoming a radio producer. So during this time, as I'm being a waitress and also working at retail, I'm making this podcast, and I'm applying to jobs and internships all over the country. I wanted Millennial to be a portfolio piece to get me a job in public radio. That was the goal. And so I got a call from This American Life, and I was a top finalist, but I was rejected. And then I got another call from a Kroc Fellowship out in Washington, D.C. with National Public Radio, and was rejected. And then I got another call back from Gimlet Media, which is in New York City, for an internship position, and they said I was overqualified. So with every disappointment, I fell back on Millennial. I continued to make this podcast until one day I got a call and I was offered a job. New Hampshire Public Radio had listened to Millennial and they loved it, and they wanted to bring me on to the team. At this moment, I was ecstatic. This is what people tell you when you're in school. You go to college, you get a job. This was my job. I felt like I had plugged into another system that was comfortable and cozy, doing this thing that I really loved. I should have stopped making a podcast. It was a means to an end. This was the end. But I couldn't stop making it. While I was at my job the first few months, I realized that there were a lot of limitations. There were a lot of things I could and could not do. And I realized that my closet, where I make this podcast, there was so much freedom. It was a place where there weren't any limitations, and where I could experiment and be myself. So I continued to make Millennial, and essentially I started living this double life. I was making the podcast and then also working a full-time job. So basically I would wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning, work on the podcast, go to work 8 hours, come home, have dinner, continue to work on the podcast, and repeat that cycle over and over again. I was making it for me. I was making it because I loved it. And right when I thought no one was listening to this passion project that I was making in my closet, it turned out everyone was listening. Sponsors, companies who wanted to support the podcast. And I was all of a sudden making a small business alongside having this full-time job. And I found myself at a crossroads because Millennial was growing at a pace that I couldn't keep up with. So I had to decide, was I going to stay in this system that's really comfortable and that I had worked really hard to get into, the system of having a full-time job? Or was I going to take a leap take a risk and commit myself to making this passion project, Millennial, full-time. Around this time last year, I sat down with my boss and I told her that I would be leaving. I was going to make Millennial full-time because I knew if I didn't, I would regret it for the rest of my life. And so, after I made that decision, there was this quote that came into my head. It says, when you make a strong determination to move in this one direction, every cell and nerve in your body will also start to move in that direction. And that's what happened. When I decided I was going to dedicate myself to making Millennial full-time, I got a call from a network in Boston a week later who said that they wanted to pick up the podcast. And then I got a call from a network in New York City who said that they wanted to pick up the podcast. In May of last year, I announced Millennial as Radiotopia's 14th edition. How many of you guys have heard of Radiotopia? Huh? Radiotopia is one of the best independent networks in the country. When I was walking across the stage 3 years ago, I could never have told you that I would be my own boss at age 26, that I would have a team of people helping me make this passion project that started out in my closet, or that we would have up to 400,000 listeners a month. Because the job that I created for myself, I didn't know existed until I made it. The funny thing is that I still work in my closet. I have created a system for myself where the growth and potential for my life and this show is limitless. Thank you.